Tonight, Enlighten is very excited to present Kirk Hanson, Director of Forestry for Northwest Natural Resource Group. He will discuss principles of ecological forestry that his organization has been developing to help forests in the Pacific Northwest adapt to changing climate. Kirk will share examples of forest management strategies that provide alternatives to conventional industrial plantation forestry that has been the standard in Northwest for decades. Kirk is a small woodland owner with over 200 acres of family-owned forest land near Olympia. He's worked on behalf of the small woodland owners for more than 25 years, bringing a passion for ecological forestry and simplified hands-on management practices that allow forest owners to take a direct role in the stewardship of their land. Kirk worked for 6 years with Washington Department of Natural Resources Small Forest Landowner Office before joining Northwest Natural Resource Group as Director of Forestry in 2006. He also teaches ecological forestry as an adjunct instructor at Evergreen State College. Please help me welcome Kirk Hanson.
Thanks, Lynn. I appreciate that. I'm going to share my screen, hopefully successfully. And do you have my cover slide up at this point?
Yes.
Great. Okay. Thank you. Well, wonderful to be here. Thank you for inviting me, Lynn and Jill. And I guess by way of an initial disclaimer about the title of this presentation, Jill approached me several months ago to ask me to present to this group. And I should have known this about Jill since she'd asked me to speak before, but she really likes to have a snappy and clever title for a presentation. And I hadn't really thought about that ahead of time. And so, when she asked me for my snappy and clever presentation title, I panicked for a little bit. I'm not always the snappiest or cleverest of thinkers when I have to think fast. And so I threw out the title of this presentation, This Ain't Your Grandfather's Forestry. And, I kind of forgot about it afterwards. But then it occurred to me that it was very similar to a title of a presentation that our executive director gave at the Ignite Seattle conference in 2018, Not Your Father's Lumberjacks. Although his presentation was about modern day logging equipment in the application of ecological forestry. So when I got to putting together this presentation, I thought, well, I should probably come up with something a little bit more original. And so I came up with the not so snappy nor clever title, On Ecological Forestry. And Jill probably just fell out of her chair right now. But that's my title for this presentation. And but what's, going back to the original title, Not Your Grandfather's Forestry, it's appropriate in some contexts because there is a constantly renewing body of science about ecological forestry that we are applying every year in the work that I do. And so, there is a very modern context, a very contemporary context to forest management that is really unlike anything that's been done in past generations. But at the same time, the title's not that appropriate because I've met with and meet with a lot of forest owners, forest practitioners all over the Northwest, and a lot of them are older foresters that have been managing their land all their lives, and in some cases for generations. And there's a lot of wisdom embodied there. And actually, I find that a lot of what I am conveying, a lot of what I'm transferring in my role as consulting forester, are practices of forest management that these old-time foresters have been practicing for a long time. And in fact, when you really look at the principles of ecological forestry, human beings have been practicing a lot of what I'm going to share with you for millennia. The title in some cases here is appropriate, but the title also became quickly ironic for me because really everything that I originally learned about the ethic and practice of good forest stewardship came from my father. the grandfather of my kids, whose wisdom is just now trickling down to their generation. So my family owned 80 acres of forest land in the St. Croix River Valley, a couple hours north of St. Paul, Minnesota. And over the course of the first 20 years of my life, my family frequently traveled to the land, as we called it, and tinkered with various forestry activities. We cut enough firewood to heat our house all winter. We tapped sugar maples and made maple syrup. We took spring water home for drinking. Not being hunters ourselves, my dad leased the annual hunting rights to our property for the value of the annual land taxes. We cross-country skied, we hiked, we camped, we picnicked, we played, and through all of this developed an awe and an appreciation for nature. Later, my dad took oak logs to a local small mill and had them turned into lumber from which we made various items, including this set of heirloom quality craftsman style living room furniture for my family. So my parents were of the Aldo Leopold School of Conservation. If you're a careful steward of the land will support you. Throughout their entire tenure on that land, my parents planted white pine beneath the hardwood dominant forest canopy. Now, white pine was the original old growth across much of the Midwest before a couple brothers from Wisconsin by the last name of Weyerhaeuser started a timber company and began logging their way west. Now, before my parents sold a conservation easement on their land to the Minnesota Land Trust and eventually sold the land altogether to a private owner, the crowns of the white pine had just begun emerging through the canopy of hardwoods. And I titled this picture, The Original Tree Huggers. So a key tenet of ecological forestry is that when we manage forests for biodiversity, we're provided with more diverse opportunities for goods and ecosystem services. So the story of Ma Pa Hanson is really a story of ecological entrepreneurialism. They recognized the wide range of values in a forest and sought to utilize many of them. So I'm now a consultant forester by profession. And when I tell people that I'm a forester, I often get a really puzzled reaction. Apparently fewer and fewer people realize there's a profession of managing, not just logging forests. So I work with people who own or manage forest land at all different scales, from 5 acres to over 100,000 acres, and help them decide how to manage their forests to meet their objectives. And that's always the first place that I start. What are your objectives? Adding to this list of broad objectives that my parents manage for are other common objectives that folks express to me these days: carbon sequestration, commercial timber production, flood mitigation, et cetera. And as you get into the practice of forest management, you quickly begin to learn that you can't optimize all of these goals simultaneously. Some of these goals are just incompatible with others. Now, regardless of how diverse a forest may be, it can't provide for 100% of our needs everywhere all of the time. I'm often approached by forest owners who tell me that they want to optimize carbon sequestration, wildlife habitat, biodiversity, fire resilience, climate adaptation, et cetera. Now, these all sound like laudable goals, right? But these clients are often disappointed and wonder if they've hired the wrong guy when I say, I can't do that for them. I can't optimize all of these values, as some of them are incompatible with each other in either the short or long term or both. There have to be trade-offs. So the first principle of forest management that you have to learn is to compromise. However, a lot of these goals are compatible or compatible to a lesser or greater degree. And if we prioritize them, we can develop silvicultural systems that emphasize a range of goals. So that's the frontispiece to my presentation. It kind of sets the stage for the rest of what I want to share with you this evening. And here's where I want to go from here. I want to give you an overview of forest ecology in the Pacific Northwest. And I want to talk about ecosystem services that forests, in particular older forests, provide. I want to make an argument for actively managing our forests in a manner that emulates old forest structure and functions versus taking solely a passive conservation approach. I want to talk about climate change and how it may affect the forests in our region. And I want to close with talking about specific forest management strategies we can use to restore these ecosystem services while providing other societal needs such as jobs, revenue, valuable forest products, etc. And at the very tail end, I'm going to wrap this up with a short video that my organization put together on forest management philosophy, the forest management philosophy that we're using at the Nisqually Community Forest up near Ashford that should tie everything together. So I want to give you or start in with a conversation about Northwest forest ecology and set the stage. Give you a primer on how forests in our region develop, some basic principles of ecology that shape forest composition, and some key structural and functional characteristics of natural forests. So we have a baseline to work from when we begin talking about how nature can serve as a model for active forest management. All forests are born from disturbance. A young forest begins its journey to old growth on a site that was disturbed from its prior condition. Now, there are many natural disturbance events that will either reset a site back to zero or alter the conditions of the site enough to stimulate the natural regeneration of a new cohort of trees. Mount St. Helens may be the most dramatic example, where the forests within the blast zone were literally reset to zero. A wind disturbance or ice storm is a more moderate example, as not all of the trees are blown down. A lot of legacy structures, such as both live and dead trees, remain, along with a lot of down dead wood that feeds an elaborate nutrient system. Along with a heterogeneous distribution of trees that endure natural disturbance events, there are also often a myriad number and species of tree seedlings in the understory that combined set the stage for the next generation of forest, depending on the nature of the disturbance. So common natural disturbance events include fire, windstorms, ice storms, landslides, disease, insects, drought. Certainly another common disturbance regime is humans, with land clearing for agriculture or development, clear-cut logging, etc. From any of these disturbance events begins a chain of sequences referred to as natural succession. Often, natural succession begins with a site becoming rapidly colonized by a pioneer species, such as red alder on wetter soils or Douglas fir on drier soils. These species tend to seed into a disturbed site at a high density, aggressively outcompete most other species, and typically form a monocultural stand of trees. Now, eventually, the dense seedlings close canopy, and the developing stand enters what is called the competitive exclusion phase, as individual trees compete with each other for increasingly limited resources, such as sunlight and soil moisture. Through the old-fashioned process of natural selection, some trees achieve dominance over others, and the less dominant trees eventually succumb to suppression mortality as they fail to adequately compete for limited resources. So take a look at this diagram. It shows the relationship of trees to one another in the canopy. As competition occurs between the trees, some trees achieve dominance, trees that have D on them. Some trees are slightly less dominant or co-dominant, C. Some trees start becoming subordinate in the stand or achieve an intermediate position in the canopy, I. And the same trees and some of the trees become suppressed beneath the closing canopy of the forest, S. And eventually these latter trees may succumb to suppression mortality, M. Many stands can remain in this competitive phase for decades, for well over 100 years, before they gradually thin themselves out and create opportunities for other plant species, trees and shrubs, to enter the stand. Now, given enough time and the absence of additional disturbance events, these formerly homogeneous stands will gradually succeed to increasing species and structural diversity. As trees continue to succumb to suppression mortality or other mortality agents such as disease and storm damage, they convert to increasingly larger snags, dead trees, that provide habitat for well over 100 species of wildlife. As trees fall in the forest, they add increasingly larger down logs to the forest floor that also provide a habitat for over 400 species of insects which in turn support an elaborate food chain. As gaps form in the canopy due to disease or windstorms, they create opportunities for other species of trees and shrubs to enter the forest. In areas where the canopy remains dense, more shade-tolerant trees, such as western red cedar or western hemlock, may establish themselves and begin their journey to eventually eclipse the dominant but less shade-tolerant Douglas fir. Now, at a broad landscape level, a region can be divided into different forest zones or vegetation zones based on which tree species eventually achieves dominance. Excuse me. Two forest ecologists at the University of Oregon, Jerry Franklin and C.T. Derniss, in the 1970s, created a system of broad vegetation types that is still used today. Most of Western Washington, for instance, is considered to be in the Western Hemlock Forest Zone. This means that if given no other major stand replacing event, Western hemlock will eventually achieve dominance and become the climax species on most sites. Now, this is largely due to its shade tolerance and that it gradually succeeds the less shade tolerant Douglas fir. Now, within these broad forest zones are subzones, such as the Puget Lowland Douglas fir zone, which is the red area on this map, which primarily occurs on droughty glacial soils. There's the Sitka spruce zone out on the coast, the green area. That occurs primarily, that occurs on the coast. Or the silver fir zone above 3,000 feet, the yellow area. That is an outcome of elevation, rainfall, temperature. In these microclimates, there are specific influencing factors that contribute to other species than Western hemlock eventually achieving dominance. Now, I find it important to point out that by some measurements, over 95% of the original old growth forests that were on the Northwest landscape prior to 1850 have been cut. For the most part, these complex ecosystems have been replaced by younger monocultural Douglas fir plantations. Andy Carey, a UW professor of silviculture and forest ecology, and who I deem to be one of the godfathers of ecological forestry, along with Jerry Franklin, when evaluating current forest cover across the Pacific Northwest, said, "Our region's forests suffer from a Douglas fir epidemic." We've taken highly complex forest ecosystems and converted them to very simplified agricultural plantations. Now, we're becoming increasingly aware of the value of the ecological services that complex forest ecosystems provide. As we weigh the logistics and costs of addressing some of the ecological problems we face, such as flood mitigation, climate change, endangered species, and wildfires, we're beginning to realize that restoring the ability of nature to resolve these problems is not only less expensive and more effective than engineering solutions, but provides a broader range of co-benefits. So let's also take a moment and look at the ecological significance of older forests, as their performance metrics are singularly unique compared to the young plantations they've been replaced with. Let's start with carbon. Old growth forests store nearly 4 times the volume of carbon than younger plantations do, and store it in a manner that is more resilient to disturbance and loss than younger forests. Older forests contain a higher volume of critical habitat structures, such as large snags and down logs, as well as habitat features that are important to rare, threatened, and endangered species. Primary forests, for example, contain an average of 90 snags and 90 down logs per acre, whereas younger 3rd or 4th generation plantations may contain none. Remember the range of wildlife species that rely on snags and down logs. Over 100 wildlife species use dead trees for part of their habitat, and over 400 species of insects use down logs for part of their habitat, and again, feed a much broader food chain. When these habitat structures are absent from a forest, so are the wildlife species that depend on them. My organization is the forest manager for the Nisqually Community Forest and up in Ashford. And when we first started the management planning process for the community forest, we worked with the EPA to model changes to watershed hydrology using different forest management scenarios. One of the outcomes of this modeling exercise was the revelation that forests older than 60 to 80 years have the capacity to retain more water higher in the watershed longer into the summer and may increase summer stream flow by more than 3 times the volume of younger plantations. Now, this was a critical finding for us, as the Mayshell watershed, of which the community forest is at the headwaters, supports an endangered population of steelhead that rely on cool summer stream flow for their survival. Old growth forests contain a significantly higher biodiversity than young, highly simplified plantations. And we're still discovering new species that occupy the complex structure of older forests, from epiphytes in the canopy to biota in the soil. Now, on average, given the soils and climate of the Pacific Northwest, forests are capable of producing about 800 board feet of timber per acre per year on a sustained basis once they reach about 50 or 60 years old. So to give you a picture of what this translates to, it takes approximately 20,000 board feet to build an average 1,400 to 1,600 square foot home. So every 25 acres of mature forest is capable of producing enough lumber to build a home just by skimming the interest, the annual growth off the top, and not even touching the principal of the forest. At today's log values, this represents about $16,000 of gross log value that can be generated from those 25 acres every year, not to mention the added value and jobs as these logs are processed into usable materials. Now, not surprisingly, more and more people have been coming to my organization asking, how do we restore old growth forests and all the values they provide? In fact, based on this overwhelming interest, we hosted a workshop a few years ago titled How to Grow Your Own Old Growth in 300 Years or Less. It was our most popular workshop ever. I think we had over 90 people attend. I think we're gonna have to host this workshop again. Now, although there are some features of old growth forests that just require time, there are active management strategies we can apply to younger forests that can accelerate development of old growth characteristics and functions in a much shorter time. Utilizing management strategies that emulate natural disturbance and stand development processes is therefore the practice of ecological forestry. So that's the prelude to my presentation. You still with me? As my lady and I often say to one another during really heady conversations, you still having fun?
Yes.
All right. So let's start talking about actual forest management, because this is where it gets really fun. So the very first premise we need to start with is that there are too many damn trees out there. Let that sink in. We've converted 95% of the original old growth forests across the Pacific Northwest to other uses, primarily even-aged, homogeneous, Douglas fir-dominated, industrially managed plantations stocked with trees at a very high density. A friend recently sent me this tagline that followed the signature in an email she received from an individual who works in the forest products industry. Get a chance to read that. Now, aside from the advocacy of wanton wastefulness, the claim that we have more trees in the US today than we did 100 years ago is incredibly misleading. Converting a modestly stocked old growth forest to a highly stocked plantation may net you more trees per acre, but there are few other ecological equivalencies. So let's assume then that our objective is to restore older forest structure and the functions that come along with them to the younger forests that we're currently working with. Our single most effective tool to achieve this objective is thinning, and in fact, using multiple thinnings over time. Why? Let me give you a scenario that will help put things in perspective. When I hike an old growth forest across the Northwest, regardless of if they're coastal or up in the Olympics or their Cascade Range, I often find that the stocking density of the very large dominant trees averages between 50 and 100 trees per acre. It's astonishingly common, sort of the same stocking no matter where I go. Now that's just considering the large canopy trees. There may be innumerable understory seedlings and saplings beneath these dominant trees, but when most people visualize old growth forests, they think of the big ones. And these account for around 50 to 100 trees per acre. Now, there's always going to be some variation to this. We're talking about complex, heterogeneous ecosystems that are shaped by highly localized microclimatic natural disturbance regimes, after all. But let's stick with this metric. So take a look at this graphic. If we're starting with a plantation or even a naturally regenerated forest, then we're likely starting with a forest that has more than 300 to 400 trees per acre. So it should be immediately logical that we have two pathways to get to our desired future condition. One, we let nature run its course. Let the stand self-thin through the competitive exclusion phase and gradually succeed the older forest structure and functions. Or two, we thin to accelerate the process. So I'm asked by many conservation groups, why can't you just lock the gates and let nature run its course? Now, my response is, well, you certainly can. I think it's a perfectly legitimate option in some locations, but there are also consequences to doing nothing, the outcomes of which may be in conflict with some of our other objectives. Specifically, highly overstocked stands lack resilience and are highly susceptible to disturbance. So let me give you some reasons why. Trees that grow in competition with one another achieve a high height to diameter ratio as they compete for sunlight. That makes them very susceptible to breakage during wind and ice storms, as well as at a stand level, highly susceptible to large-scale blowdown. High stocking densities often result in highly stressed trees, as they're all competing for increasingly limited resources. Highly stressed trees are more susceptible to insects and diseases. If the limiting resource is water, highly stocked stands are also much more prone to drought-induced mortality. Now, highly stocked stands accumulate large amounts of dead biomass as suppression mortality converts small diameter suppressed trees into dead trees and dead down woody material. And the highly simplified stand structure comprised of these smaller diameter trees is highly susceptible to forest fires. Now, highly stocked stands provide very simplified habitat features and have limited value to wildlife. And lastly, highly stocked stands result in very slow growing trees, which delays the ability of the forest to produce merchantable timber products and may result in overall lower value timber. So I think this is a good moment to take an aside about carbon sequestration, as increasingly people are asking me, how can we optimize forests for carbon? First of all, to be perfectly honest, if our sole objective is to maximize the ability of a forest to sequester and store carbon, then the best management strategy is to do nothing. Forests in the Northwest, and this is presumably true elsewhere, will optimize photosynthetic leaf surface area, which drives primary production of biomass, and remain in a near optimal biomass accumulation phase for many decades, if not centuries, until the ecosystem reaches a steady state equilibrium between biomass accumulation and decay. Now, even though individual tree growth will slow down in an overstocked and highly competitive forest, at the stand level, there is still rapid biomass accumulation occurring. As suppressed trees succumb to mortality, live biomass gets converted to dead biomass, but from a carbon standpoint, there is still a net positive accumulation occurring across both live and dead pools of carbon in a forest. So recently, our executive director and our lead timber sales manager conducted a thought exercise to compare the differences in carbon sequestration in the same forest managed under 4 different silvicultural regimes over a 160-year period of time. They started with a Douglas fir plantation planted in 1980 at a standard density of about 350 trees per acre. And the silvicultural regimes included business as usual clear cuts every 40 years, extended rotation or clear cuts on 80-year cycles instead of 40, thinning every 20 years and never clear cutting, and then lastly, no management. We used an open source forest growth model developed by the US Forest Service called the Forest Vegetation Simulator, or FVS, to run the scenarios. And the model takes into consideration the dynamics of carbon in several different pools of forest, forest products when you harvest, and then eventually landfills, and assigns both a decay rate or a growth and decay rates for each of these. Now, quite demonstrably, the no management scenario shows superior results in carbon sequestration. Now, perhaps not surprisingly, the business as usual 40-year rotation pathway performed the worst, as a lot of carbon gets lost during the logging and manufacturing process, and a lot of carbon also quickly ends up in landfills, where it then becomes a carbon source again. Now, extended rotation and thinning performed considerably better, as more carbon remains in the forest, and there are less opportunities for consistent losses through the logging and manufacturing process. Now, as an advocate of active forest management, I found it particularly noteworthy that the total carbon sequestration rate under a thin-only regime was not too far off from the no management. And this is partly due to keeping a forest in a near optimal growth phase, while consistently converting some portion of the timber to long-lived forest products. However, the wild card in this whole modeling exercise is that FVS cannot predict and therefore model the effects of natural disturbance. And therefore, the superior results of the no management scenario are somewhat dubious. If we can absolutely guarantee that this forest will not be adversely affected by any type of natural disturbance, then arguably the right course of action is to do nothing and just let it grow. However, if you want to know how to make nature laugh, tell her your plans. With the assumption that natural disturbance happens, shit happens, and given the fact that we likely have more objectives than solely carbon sequestration, then we're back to the justification for active management, thinning. And our goal should be to manage for resilience, in particular relative to climate change, so we can help ensure the forests in our region can sequester and store carbon for the long term. All right, now I promised to start talking about forest management, but I just provided my own segue to talk a bit about climate change for a moment and its effects on Northwest forests. So we have to get this in somewhere because, climate change, we don't seem to be able to avoid it. So my organization hosted a series of seminars a few years ago on the topic of climate adaptation for Northwest forests and published a guidebook for forest managers. The guidebook and all of our presentation, or all of the presentations, are on our website, and they're a tremendous body of useful information. Now, during her interview or overview presentation on climate change in the Northwest, Jessica Holofsky, a climate research scientist with the Washington DNR, presented this slide. Now, I interpret this slide like this. If we get our shit together as a global community and enact meaningful measures to combat carbon emissions, then average temperatures in the Northwest will still go up, an anticipated 2 to 5 degrees over the next 80 years. Now, if we don't get our shit together, then temperatures may increase as much as 5 to 13 degrees. Under this latter business as usual scenario, this translates to the Puget Sound experiencing similar temperatures in 80 years as Sacramento, California. Think about that. I like Sacramento, but I'd rather visit there than have it come here, right? So the average or the overall prediction for rainfall is that the Northwest will likely continue to receive the same annual amount, but it will be even more concentrated during winter months with longer, drier summers. Weather events will become more extreme, which directly translates to more severe weather-driven disturbance events. Warming temperatures may trigger insect outbreaks, may make new diseases viable in our forests, and could set the stage for more frequent, larger-scale forest fires. Now, it's quite possible that we're already beginning to see the impacts of climate change in our forests. I've personally noticed a dramatic increase in tree mortality across the Northwest, in particular amongst the least drought-tolerant species, such as Western hemlock, grand fir, Western red cedar. Now, the forests of British Columbia just endured a 20-year epidemic pine beetle outbreak that ravaged hundreds of thousands of hectares. We've endured several recent years of record or near record wildfire burns. So it's highly likely that climate change is exacerbating these occurrences. But I would also caution you not to point the finger entirely at climate change. Now remember, our forests are in a highly disturbed condition due to a history of past management and arguably past mismanagement that has resulted in them currently being stocked at a very high density compared to the long-term carrying capacity of the site. For tree species that can take hundreds of years to develop to maturity, there are very few forests in the Northwest that have even achieved 100 years of age since first being cut, and are, biologically speaking, still in a relatively early successional stage. So a lot of the mortality we're currently seeing in our forests may therefore very well be the outcome of the natural process of self-thinning and species adjustment. And we're essentially finding ourselves in the middle of the competitive mortality phase of forest development. So this doesn't mean that we can breathe a deep sigh of relief and say, oh, don't worry, Mother Nature has it all covered. Remember that these early stages of forest recovery also make forests more vulnerable or prone to disturbance, in particular fire. We often live in forested landscapes. We want a sustainable provision of forest products and ecosystem services. We don't want to see our forests endure catastrophe. So I was invited recently to Bainbridge Island to work with the land trust there to assess their forests and make management recommendations. Over recent years, they were seeing a rapid increase in tree mortality, in particular cedar, across many of their forests, and they're becoming increasingly concerned about the health of forests in general across the island. Now, Bainbridge Island is essentially a large glacial moraine left behind by the Vashon Glacier when it retreated approximately 14,000 years ago. Most, if not all, of the primary forests on that island were cut by the 1920s to feed the mill at Port Blakely, which was once the largest lumber mill in the world. Replanting laws weren't required until the 1940s. So most of the current forests on the island are comprised of a dense hodgepodge of naturally regenerated conifers and hardwoods. Now, one of nature's strategies for colonizing a site is to throw a lot of seed at it from a lot of different plants. What happens then is you get a broad mix of species, all of which may not necessarily be suitable for the site in the long term. For instance, Western red cedar, grand fir, and Western hemlock are not particularly drought tolerant. The fact that we're seeing an increase in mortality amongst these species on droughty, glacially dry soils may have more to do with their unsuitability for the site, and the forest stands in which they occur are going through a natural process of selective thinning, as the less drought tolerant trees gradually fade from the most droughty sites and are replaced by more drought tolerant species, such as Douglas fir, pine, Pacific madrone, maple, or oak. However, this self-thinning process is contributing a lot of dead and dry wood to a historically fire-prone ecosystem that people now occupy at a high density. Okay, so I want to transition to talking about the art and science of applied ecological forestry. I think this is what you're actually here for. So thanks for bearing with me while I got some of that prelude material out of the way. So I distill the practice of ecological forestry into two fundamental principles: right tree for the right location, and stocking density, or how many trees there are in a given area. Usually we measure it by trees per acre. So we must think very carefully about the long-term viability of tree species for a particular site. As our climate changes, some sites may get wetter, some sites may get drier, some sites may get shadier, some sites may be more exposed. Now, like any species, trees have a range of preferences relative to soil type, moisture, and sunlight, and a range of tolerance. And what we're likely seeing now is the range of tolerance for all trees shrinking. So we must also be conscious of how many trees there are and of what species by recognizing both compatibilities and competition between trees. we begin to understand what happens with forests at various stocking levels. So if we can agree on four things. One, most of our forests are in a disturbed condition relative to their historic norm. Two, most of our forests are overstocked relative to the long-term carrying capacity of the site. Three, the future climate regime will be different from the past and may support even fewer trees per acre. And finally, four, doing nothing may incur increasing risks for most forests. Then it should stand to reason that one of our best strategies for improving the condition of our forests is thinning, the selective cutting and potentially removal of various trees. How we go about doing this is, I believe, the central practice of ecological forestry. So regardless of what our objectives may be, I think every forest owner or manager will say that they want a healthy forest. However, forest health quickly becomes a specious word as it commonly has anthropogenic connotations. For instance, we often define forest health in terms of factors that either limit or enhance the ability of a forest to provide what humans want, such as timber. I prefer to use the word resilience. In terms of forest ecosystems, resilience refers to the ability to adapt to and recover from disturbance, in particular climate change. The goal of ecological forestry, then, is to manage forests that are resilient and productive. So if we can accept the argument that thousands of years of successional development has led to forest ecosystems that are both productive and resilient to disturbance, then I believe that one of the most instructive models we can have for how to manage our forests are the effects of natural disturbance regimes. And we should design a system of silviculture that emulates, to the extent possible, those effects. In my way of thinking, the basic elements of ecological forestry are therefore to mimic natural forest processes, to improve forest structural diversity and biodiversity, to increase ecological capital and ecosystem services, to restore ecological resilience, and then to diversify financial values. I mean, we do want something out of these forests as well. We as humans rely on forests for all sorts of things. And then lastly, increase aesthetics, because hey, you know, who doesn't like beautiful forests, right? So I want to conclude by taking you back through the successional processes of a forest, from disturbance to development of late serial characteristics and functions, but with the addition of active management. So you can see the application of various principles of ecological forestry. So the very first stage in the successional process, again, is referred to as stand initiation. This is when a site gets colonized by vegetation or by trees. However, from a management standpoint, we're going to go out and plant that site manually. And the reasons for this are to rapidly colonize the site and optimize the photosynthetic capacity of that site to produce biomass for timber or carbon sequestration. By planting it, we can also make sure that the right tree species are planted on the right site and avoid some of the consequences of trees that are unsuitable for the site taking seed there. And we can also use species that are appropriate for our goals. If it's biodiversity, we may plant a very wide range of species. If it's timber production, we may focus on a few species. With each of these stages, I'm also going to talk a little bit about or just share some of the costs of these steps, as well as some of the revenue that's generated. So on average, the planting cost for a site is going to be about $450 to $600 per acre. This doesn't include site preparation. And as a caveat, these costs are going to vary widely, so don't take them literally. This is just more so to provide you with some trends. So looking at establishing a site from a graphical standpoint, on the left, we have what represents a 20th acre plot that is stocked with the equivalent of 400 trees per acre. This is our planting density. And on the right is our desired future condition, the 50 trees per acre. We're going to get there from here eventually. Now, a couple notes about planting seedlings. There is an emerging, I would say, theory, perhaps even evolving into a science, of a climate adaptation strategy then, for establishing seedlings on a site that will be adapted to that site under the future climate regime. It's referred to as assisted species migration. And there is a tool that the Forest Service developed called the Seed Lot Selection Tool. This is open to anybody. You can Google it, get online, and tinker with it. And it will tell you what areas around the world or in the United States are emblematic of the climate regime that our particular area will have in the future, 80 years out, 100 years out. And we can use this tool then to go source seed stock from those latitudes that represent our future climate regime and take those seedlings and plant them up here. So again, this is a increasing strategy we're using to start adjusting the adaptability of our forests to future climate regimes. And in fact, my organization, along with a few other partners, are working on a multi-year study, and you can find information on this on our website, to look at how these tree genetics, these tree seedlings and tree species from southern latitudes do when planted under a current climate regime. And so we planted out a large area and are currently monitoring those seedlings to see how they perform. I think we have a 2-year update on the progress on our website currently. So moving ahead in the forest successional pathway, as the young plantation that we establish grows up and enters the stem exclusion phase, and this is going to happen between ages 15 to 25 years, those seedlings close canopy and start growing into a competitive phase with one another. And our strategy at that point is to come in and pre-commercially thin. This means cutting trees, but not removing any trees or selling them. It's just purely a cut and drop. And again, comes at a cost, obviously, anywhere ranging from $150 to $400 per acre. Now, the goal or the purpose of this is to accelerate the self-thinning process and the natural species selection process for the site that would normally happen under a natural forest successional pathway. So we're coming in and we are decreasing the number of trees that we're accelerating. We're trying to skip over the stem exclusion phase or the competitive exclusion phase and accelerate growth of individual trees. Some of the other objectives are to improve timber value by maintaining optimal growth of the most dominant and or preferred trees. And then also, again, adjust species for the site. So if there happen to be species that we don't feel are suitable on that site, we can preemptively remove them. So graphically, we're going to remove about 40 to 50% of the trees at the time and drop that original stocking density from 400 trees per acre down to about 240 trees per acre. Now, during this practice, there's a number of things that we can do to start enhancing some of the ecological functions of these very young forests. We can take some of this material, this cut material, the poles, for instance, and stack them together like you see in this image in the foreground and create constructed habitat logs. Now, these constructed logs emulate some of the biological functions and habitat values of the large old growth logs that are missing in most second, third growth forests. In the background of this image, you'll see what's called a wildlife habitat pile. And again, it provides some of the habitat functions of downwood on the forest floor. Also, okay, so stepping ahead a little bit, stand is growing now. It's about 30, 40 years old. Still in the stem exclusion phase. There's still a lot of competition between the trees. At this age, now the trees are finally beginning to get big enough that they have commercial viability. And so the thinning at this point now becomes a commercial thinning and produces net revenue. The objective, again, is to continue to accelerate the self-thinning process by further reducing the stocking density, again, favoring the most dominant trees that are suitable for the site. And this can generate about $500 per acre. Again, it's going to vary depending on the site. We refer to this kind of thinning as thinning from below. Let's get back to that graphic of the canopy placement of trees. So again, looking at this graphic, it shows you again the competitive relationship between these trees. So thinning from below means that we're coming in and basically emulating the process of nature weeding the weak and the lame out of the forest. We'll primarily be cutting the suppressed and the intermediate trees and maybe a few of the co-dominant trees to reduce the competitive aspects of this forest and release the more dominant trees and some of the co-dominant trees. During this thinning, we're going to take out about a third of the trees at the time and reduce the stocking density from the prior roughly 240 trees per acre down to about 180 trees per acre. Now, during this second thinning process and our first commercial thinning process, we can really start getting a little more creative with enhancing the ecosystem functions and values of the forest. First of all, if there are snags in the forest, we're going to protect them. We're going to work around them. We're likely even going to buffer them. If there are not snags in the forest, we can use this equipment to reach up and snip a tree 20, 30 feet up and create a snag. Also, in a lot of our second generation forests, there are old growth stumps still out there, and we're going to buffer those stumps. We're going to leave trees around them. And we've recently started doing this mostly by being inspired by Suzanne Simard. And if you're not familiar with Suzanne Simard, she's a forest ecologist with the University of British Columbia. And she recently wrote a book called Finding the Mother Tree. And it's all about the mycelial network underneath forest soils and how trees exchange nutrients with each other. And she has drawn attention to these legacy structures also in forests, the big snags, the stumps, the down logs, and how they function as refugia for all sorts of biota. So using the Hippocratic Oath, we are making the decision to buffer these stumps and protect them so they can continue to provide nutrients and important biological functions to the forest. The other thing we're going to do is if hardwoods are present in the stand, we're going to retain them. We're going to make sure that we protect them, even enhance their growth. Because the one thing we know is that with an increase in hardwoods in the forest, we also get an increase in bird species. Another practice is when we are logging and taking cut material to the landing to be processed, when the skidder goes back out to grab some more logs, it grabs some of that slash, the treetops and the branches, the non-merchant material, and brings it back out with it and spreads it either on the forest floor or on the paths that the skidder is driving on in order to minimize compaction of soils and soil disturbance and incorporate that organic matter back into the soil so it can feed the soil. So moving ahead another 10, 20 years or so, the forest is still in the stem exclusion phase, still a lot of competition between the trees, still at a very high density compared to the historic carrying capacity for the site. So we're going to continue to thin. And now we're going to use a strategy called variable density thinning. And every once in a while, we get to use some very unique equipment like this Ponzi processor here that has extremely low ground pressure and therefore very little disturbance on the forest soils. And as you can see in this, it's reaching out and grabbing some of those smaller diameter suppressed trees. And again, we're leaving by and large the more dominant trees. But in a variable density thin, we're now starting to move from thinning to a relatively even spacing and taking out the most suppressed trees and starting to work on some of the structural heterogeneity in the forest. So we're still accelerating the self-thinning process, but we're moving towards creating a more heterogeneous composition, both with species, stocking density, and structural complexity. And graphically, it looks a little bit like this. You've got the prior stand in the upper left, and then you have a thin stand down below. And as you can see, the spatial distribution of trees is very heterogeneous. We have some areas of higher stocking, some areas of lower stocking. We might have some small gaps. We might have areas that are just, anyway, across the whole thing, you have spatial heterogeneity, spatial or a wide range of stocking densities. Because we find that, again, wildlife in particular, different wildlife species will find preferential habitat across this wide range of forest composition. And we've further reduced the stocking density overall of those dominant canopy trees by another third. And in this process of thinning, another thing happens. Now, obviously, we're using heavy equipment in the forest, and there is a fair bit of ground disturbance. We are exposing a lot of soil. And this might seem counterintuitive, but we're actually using logging as a disturbance agent. It's disturbing the soil. Now, this exposed mineral soil becomes a seed bed. And what we find that we're actually doing is stimulating the natural regeneration of trees in the understory now of this forest. So we've set the stage for the next cohort of trees to get established beneath the current dominant canopy of trees. And for the first time now, this forest is beginning to grow into a multi-age and more structurally complex forest composition. A drone photo of the Nisqually Community Forest. Looking down, you can see the spatial distribution of trees. And what's particularly interesting about this photo, obviously taken during the winter time, is by opening the canopy, we're getting more snow down at the ground level and increasing snow accumulation rates. So at higher elevations, this is extremely important for retaining snow and retaining the moisture in that snow higher in the landscape to be released to downstream, released downstream into the watershed later into the summer. So we're going to conduct another thinning, another variable density thinning in another 10, 20 years or so. And this is again where we continue to tease out even more structural heterogeneity in the stand. In this project on Vashon Island, in Island Center Forest, this was not managed by us, this is managed by another colleague, used some very interesting equipment to emulate a wind disturbance. So if you look at the forest composition around this machine, you can see a very heterogeneous stocking of both tree species, tree ages. And again, this is intended to mimic the disturbance effects of a windstorm. And then the disturbance of the equipment in there, again, creates an exposed mineral seed bed, and we've stimulated natural regeneration of another cohort of trees. Now we've reduced that stocking density by another third down to about 80 trees per acre, getting very close to that final stocking density of the legacy trees that we want to have be future old growth. One of the strategies we use during one of our variable density thins is starting to cut in small gaps. These could be an acre, 2 acres, 3 acres at most. And these gaps are intended to emulate the natural disturbance effects of a windstorm or a disease pocket that kills off all the trees in a very specific area. And when we apply this strategy, or we're deliberately applying this strategy again up at the Nisqually Community Forest at about 3,000 feet, obviously in the snow zone. And we cut in just this past summer, a couple 1 acre gaps up there so far. We'll be doing more next year. And we installed cameras and stadia rods to monitor snow levels. And what we found so far with some of our monitoring, just as of a couple of weeks ago, that we're seeing a 40% increase in snow accumulation in these gaps as compared to the understory of the forest. And again, this is significant because it's allowing this landscape to hold more moisture higher in the landscape longer into the spring and, well, certainly not the summer months, not the snowpack, but the soil moisture higher in the watershed. And so our final entry, at least to manage that, that first cohort of trees, is going to be something that we call a variable retention harvest. This is the last harvest we do now of that dominant tree class. Again, we're going to take about a third of the trees and finally reduce that final stocking density down to the old growth stocking. Now, these are legacy trees that we will leave indefinitely, as long as nature allows them to stand. They may grow for hundreds of years. They may fall within a few years and then become downed woody habitat structures in the forest. However, by this time, now that we're this far into the successional process of the forest, there likely are multiple cohorts coming up underneath that canopy, and the thinning process begins all over again with those understory cohorts. And this is how we achieve a sustainable, perpetual thinning process in these forests if our objective is to continue to manage for timber production. If our objective is solely restoring old growth structure, we may step out at this point. We may step out at a prior thinning and say, okay, we have achieved structural diversification, and now we're going to let natural disturbance events be the shaping agents of this forest going forward. So I'm at the end of my presentation, and I want to close by bringing it all back to the title of this presentation, that this ain't your grandfather's forestry. However, I'm going to correct myself, because again, this is your grandfather's forestry. This is my kids' grandfather's forestry. This is what I began learning from my parents. Here they are working on one of our forested tracts in Washington. My dad's 94, my mom's 89. They continue to get out there on a regular basis and manage the little tree seedlings on their forest. And I want to draw your attention to something that's a little hard to see in the bottom right of this photo, but my dad needs a little help getting through the brush nowadays. And as part of his ensemble of tools, he attached a machete to his cane. So he can work his way into the brush, take out his machete, cut back the competing vegetation around the tree seedlings to make sure that they continue to grow. And people always ask him, what's the key to your long life here, to your longevity? And he says, just don't sit down for too long. So if I leave you with any inspiration to get out there and do something positive for our forests, don't sit down too much. Get out there, work actively in your forests. So I thank you for your time. And what I want to do again is wrap this all up and have Jose queue up a very short video. It's about 4 or 5 minutes of the work that my organization has done in the Nisqually Community Forest. And then I think we'll open it up and have some questions and conversation. I'm Kirk Hanson, Director of Forestry for the Northwest Natural Resource Group. I'm also on the board of directors of the Nisqually Community Forest, a community-owned and managed forest in the foothills of the Cascade Mountains. We recently embarked on a new project here that's going to improve the health of the forest and provide lasting economic opportunities for the surrounding community. The lands around here are usually clear-cut at a young age, which is the preferred system for most commercial forestry operations. Clear-cutting this forest really reduces the opportunities for this community. It will generate a significant amount of revenue, but then there's a long period of time when that revenue is no longer available. It would also degrade wildlife habitat in the forest and the amount of carbon it's storing. We're doing things here a little differently. The model of forestry we're using, ecological forestry, is designed to achieve many more objectives than just short-term cash income. By selectively thinning the forest, we're removing some of the trees from areas where there's too much competition, which will allow the remaining trees to grow bigger, faster. This also leaves trees the community forest can harvest later to generate more revenue in the future. Thinning the stand, we're reducing the stocking density. We're taking a forest that had 300, 400 trees per acre and bringing it down to 200, 220 trees per acre. That's going to reduce the amount of water the trees demand, which is particularly important in a warmer, drier climate. As trees grow older, they transpire less moisture from the soil, allowing the ground to act like a water reservoir. By thinning and creating small patch cuts, we also open up the canopy of the forest, which will allow snowpack on the forest floor to melt slower throughout the spring, improving summer stream flows, critical for salmon. Parts of this forest are very dense, very uniform, without much of an understory, which makes for poor wildlife habitat.
Thinning and gap creation will allow more light to hit the forest floor, which invigorates understory plants that sustain wildlife. We're also thinning in a way that improves vertical complexity in the tree canopy, retains habitat structures like snags and down logs, and allows a more diverse range of tree species to naturally regenerate. A big part of the Nisqually Community Forest Management Plan is bringing parts of the forest back to old-growth conditions. Old-growth forests perform key ecological functions like providing habitat for endangered species and storing vast amounts of carbon in wood and soil. Without management, this forest would have naturally thinned itself over the years, but it would take a long time. This harvest, on the other hand, is going to propel the forest toward old-growth structure and functions faster than it would on its own. So, unlike clear-cutting, where income is the main goal, this method of forestry balances a lot of objectives at the same time. We're setting up the forest to be more ecologically and economically resilient in the long term, while providing jobs for local forestry contractors and a sustained source of revenue for the community forest. That blend is called ecological forestry, and this is how we're putting it into practice.
Okay, wonderful. That's the film in a way summed up what you said. So it was nice to have that overview. And we've got some very nice chats here now. One of them is, do you have the ear for the in the Department of Natural Resources?
Well, a lot of the forest ecologists, the climate scientists, the entomologists that we work with are within the Department of Natural Resources. So I would say that this emerging science of ecological forestry is definitely coming up through the ranks of the staff within the DNR. I mean, this is really a societal shift. We're seeing this being implemented by more and more public agencies as they respond to the mandate to manage for a broader range of societal values. A very close friend of mine, Derek Churchill, for instance, is in charge. He works at the DNR, is in charge of landscape level planning for forest health and climate adaptation. So a lot of these strategies that I've shared with you are strategies that he pioneered as a professor of forestry at the University of Washington under the tutelage of Jerry Franklin. So I would say yes. Obviously, with any large public agency, going from science to policy to implementation is slow, but it is absolutely happening.
Well, there's a couple of very specific questions. When you when you start thinning and get little places in the forest that are open, do blackberries and those ivy and other species, other trees and little shrubby things, do they take over? And is that a good thing or a bad thing?
It really depends on what the vector is for those species. So if you have highly invasive species in close proximity to a forest that's being thinned and having any kind of soil disturbance, absolutely. And therefore, we have to have a post-thinning or a post-harvest plan in place to address those species as they come into the forest. So that is certainly a consequence of disturbance, whether it's natural disturbance or human-caused disturbances. You do create the opportunity for invasive species to come in. So again, the response to that is to have a plan in place to know that this is going to happen, first of all, and have a plan in place to come in and address those species as they begin to colonize that site to make sure that native species have the opportunity to get established there.
And another thing is that one person said that Kitsap County Parks, they sometimes take out 4/5 of mostly Douglas firs. I don't know if this, you can tell me how how true this is in your experience, the largest and commercially harvestable ones, leaving Douglas firs and non-Douglas firs. And all those stumps and roots are there, which destroy the forest floor and the natural soil structure. But anyway, they leave a mess. I think that this person is referring to what's happening at the Newberry Hill, that park, you know, the Newberry Hill Park. Anyway, I think that's what's happening there. So do you know anything about the county, is what we're saying?
I don't, in that specific example, I'm not sure if I fully understood the question or the point being made, but other than, you know, I'll be perfectly frank that when we go in and do a timber harvest, a selective thinning like I described, it looks like hell afterwards. You know, you're going to walk through that forest and you'll see disturbed soils. You might see some trees, there should be very few that have been damaged by the logging. You know, it's very difficult to come into a forest with heavy iron like that and not have any impact. But as I described, you know, some of that disturbance is beneficial. It does create the opportunity for new seedlings to get established. And in our commercial timber harvesting, we work with a very select pool of logging contractors that specialize in thinning. So they understand how to carefully work within a forest and extract timber logs with the least amount of impact possible. But I'm not going to stand here and say that there is no impact. Of course there is. That's part of perhaps the consequence or part of what we have to accept using an active thinning approach.
I think the point was that the county takes all the big, beautiful trees.
Gotcha. Yeah, I can't speak to that. When that happens, that's referred to as high grading. So, and this has been the standard in the Northwest for decades that loggers or whoever the forest manager will come in and take the highest quality trees out, leave the lowest quality, and that's referred to as high grading. And if that happens time and time again, you obviously degrade both the long-term value of that forest as well as the ecological services that it provides. So the type of thinning that we're doing is, of course, quite the inverse of that. So it certainly is.
Talk to our public officials on that, really. Another one is Forest Ridge Park is only 17 acres. Is that big enough to be a forest?
Certainly. I'd say I'm not sure if there's a minimum size definition for a forest. This could be the debate of ecologists. Usually the smallest forest that we work with, my organization works with, tends to be about 5 acres. So, you kind of need to tease out a few things here. If you're talking about commercially viable, how much do you need to come in and do some commercial thinning? That's going to be at least 5 acres. If you're talking about more from an ecological standpoint, what is the definition of a forest? I would argue that if you have a complex ecosystem in your backyard that has ground covers, has a shrub layer, has a low tree layer, has a canopy layer, is species diverse, both in plants and trees, and brings in a wide range of wildlife, you have a forest.
Do you know about wildlife corridors?
I know the principle. So at a landscape level, it's how do we connect disparate ecosystems so wildlife can travel between them. And there, I know with larger public entities, the state that owns large blocks of contiguous forest land, the U.S. Forest Service, Park System, there's a lot of discussion about how to create wildlife corridors between these different intact ecosystems. It's certainly a discussion amongst conservation groups, land trusts, as they acquire land. Can they acquire land that creates corridors between public lands? Oftentimes, riverways function as wildlife corridors. And so protecting the forested riparian areas on either side of a river allows wildlife to follow those river corridors and function as wildlife habitat corridors. Just to put it out there, my organization doesn't work as much at a landscape level like that as we do with individual forest owners. So the concept of implementing wildlife corridors at the scale that I work at doesn't come into play that often. But
sounds like also the public probably has to get involved sometimes in that kind of thing. You know this, the Hidden Life of Trees by Peter Woden, and of course you know that book. Do you use, when you're selecting your trees to take away and leaving the big, what they sometimes call mother trees there, it sounds like you're keeping the principles that Peter writes about in the Hidden Life of Trees and other books about trees that he's written. You take that into consideration, actually.
Yes, yeah. If you remember my example of, and I think I forgot to use the term, the mother stumps. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of the same concept as the mother tree, that we recognize the biological value of some of these legacy structures in the forest, whether they're dead structures like stumps or large snags, or living structures such as old growth trees, or just older trees to begin with. We are specifically identifying those structures in the forest and not only retaining them, but buffering them, because the benefit of those structures extends a considerable distance out from the tree or stump or snag itself. So there's kind of a whole strategy to properly retaining these legacy structures so you can continue to optimize or at least not interfere with their ecological functions.
I've got to make a point. When you say snag, I'm going to say snag just to make it sound different. The CC, the closed caption, says snakes. So just
okay, thank you for that clarification. Yes, snag, S-N-A-G, plural S. Dead tree, but more specifically, a dead tree that is actively being used by wildlife for some part of its habitat needs.
This might be the last one, but what recommendations do you have for the Department of Natural Resources in their monthly timber sales of state trust land parcels? I really want to know that too, because who the heck is in charge of selling our state's heritage and who do they sell it to?
Whew. That's a controversial topic to weigh into. First of all, I know a lot of the silviculturalists, the forest managers. I know a lot of the biologists that are working there. I know a lot of the policy folks that work in the policy shops of the DNR. And I trust a lot of them to be making very good decisions in both what's being conserved and in what's being cut. Are they all the time in every case? No. I think there's a lot of controversy right now about cutting some of these older forests, these 100-year-old forests that are beginning to express some of the structural characteristics and functions of old growth, not to mention the carbon that's sequestered in them. My interest would be in seeing these forests very selectively thinned, versus certainly clear cut. I think there is a role for active light thinning, selective thinning to continue to adjust species composition, stocking, reduce competition, et cetera. I think where it becomes a little more problematic is when we are taking these older forests that, again, are extraordinary carbon sinks and clear cutting them and converting them to younger forest, just like I exemplified in my presentation.
So there's going to be two more, actually. So one, I'm going to ask both of the questions and then you can answer both of them. But one person wants to know about your that machine, that big machine that took them out vertically, and the trees out vertically. And then this is a political thing, it's sort of a recurring theme on some of these questions. But how do we make our city and county officials, one, cognizant of what you're saying? I think they probably are cognizant, but they're not doing it. And how can we hold them accountable?
Right. Okay. Well, I'm not sure what the specific question is around that machine, but with the logging contractors that I work with, like I mentioned, they have the right kind of equipment and the right kind of skills to do as low of impact logging as is possible when you're still bringing large hydraulic equipment into the woods. So in that case, what that machine is doing is it's able to reach out, grab a tree, a saw comes out, cuts it from the stump, and then it carries it out of the forest and lays it down at a landing where then that tree is processed into logs. The machine goes back in and grabs another tree. What's nice about that is that the operator has 100% control over that tree the entire time. So rather than cutting that tree and as it falls, it's banging into other trees that we want to save, knocking bark off, causing other damage. It's a highly focused, it's a very precise way of removing trees from the forest to minimize impact. And there's a lot of different types of equipment that function that way. Then to the latter point, I would say this is the evolution of public policy. And I would give credit to a lot of public entities that are doing this work. The city of Seattle Cedar River watershed, I think, is implementing some of the most progressive forest management practices probably in the country, if not the world right now, under the guidance of some amazing silviculturalists, forest managers up there. A lot of what I have learned about ecological forestry has come from what they've been doing up there for the past 20 years. We work a lot with King County and all the county-owned forest lands there. Again, a very progressive forestry staff implementing precisely the types of strategies that I outlined here. To toot our own horn, they're contracting with us in part and other forest consultants to advance the science of forest management and county-owned forest lands. Kitsap County also is looking at these kind of strategies, beginning to implement different types of thinning strategies, variable density thinning within county-owned forest lands. So we're seeing it happen more and more. There's some very progressive forestry happening on state DNR lands right now as well. We can certainly pick out occurrences here and there that we disagree with, but the tide is rising in a positive way across all sorts of public entities. The way we continue to get their attention is presentations like this, getting them in touch with their contemporaries in other public agencies that are doing the same thing. And then certainly just the good old fashioned public pressure and say, hey, we want to see more from our forests. My concern is that we're seeing the pendulum swing from maximum resource extraction to preservation. And public entities now are afraid to do anything because of the backlash of folks that think we should lock the gates and walk away. And I hope I've articulated the folly of that approach to thinking. That may be legitimate in some areas, but not in highly populated areas. And we really should be thinking a little more openly about some of these active management strategies, in particular to accelerate ecosystem functions in these highly disturbed forests.
The two things, and we should put pressure on our mayors and on our county commissioners to hire the right people. That's basically it, who understand the kind of modern techniques. But one final thing is, you mentioned the state level, we're doing many good things. What about this Keep Washington Evergreen plan? Have you heard of that plan?
I have, but I don't know much about the guts and feathers of it. So I don't think I could speak articulately to it.
That was the question, whether you could. Well, I don't see any more questions here. And so I'm going to thank you again. And it was a wonderful presentation. And thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.